Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you guys liked that basketball segment because we are sticking in the basketball world and discussing a potential trade, actually a real-time trade that already happened and its ensuing fantasy implications for both teams involved. Yes, I'm talking about the Dejounte Murray trade, kind of the first big trade of this window. We see Dejounte Murray, an exciting young guard, moving to a New Orleans Pelicans team that wants to kind of find that balance between guys like Zion and Brandon Ingram and guys like CJ McCollum and now Dejounte Murray. And so I kind of feel like this trade certainly swings the pendulum in favor of the Pelicans in terms of who won it, just because of the sheer amount of abilities that Dejounte Murray can bring to this. I think he's a fantastic defensive asset. I think he adds the length at the shooting guard position should he be the starter by the start of the season. He's kind of a 3-and-D type player. He adds balance already to CJ McCollum should the Pelicans organization view him as a second option off the bench, but I don't think that will be the case. I think that ultimately what Dejounte Murray can also bring is he can create a lot of looks for Zion inside, so he's not necessarily having to create for himself in isolation. And also, in terms of Brandon Ingram, I think that Ingram will still be able to offer his similar kind of level of production as he goes on as well. But looking at this trade, the New Orleans Pelicans for the past couple of years have always been a weird team, especially with the goings-on of this player like Zion Williamson. Because when he's healthy, he certainly is very electric, very dynamic in the way he plays. He's very aggressive and powerful at the point of attack. I really think that there's tremendous upside should Zion continue to play and be fully fit. But I just feel like he needed someone who allows him to just stay healthy. I think that Zion kind of pushes himself a little bit too much, and as a result, the wear and tear on his much larger body and larger physique ultimately wears him down a lot and thus leads to more injury. But now with the addition of Dejounte Murray, he doesn't necessarily have to create as much for this offense. He can just occupy the paint, maybe work the pick and roll game, and have Dejounte Murray kind of be that distributor of the ball that the Pelicans so desperately needed. And ultimately, I kind of feel like Zion, as a power forward, doesn't necessarily have to space the floor as much for the Pelicans. Dejounte Murray will be tasked with that. In terms of guys like Ingram and McCollum who have a similar profile to Dejounte Murray, I think they'll be just fine. I think that Brandon Ingram, he's an incredible shot creator. So is CJ McCollum. He is also a fantastic distributor of the ball. Maybe not the best defender on this team, but that's certainly what Dejounte Murray can help out with if they should they play together. But right now, I kind of feel like the Pelicans can certainly vault themselves into contention in the crowded West. Obviously, we're going to have to see this team on the court to see if everything gels, because on paper it looks fantastic, but everything just needs to come together for this Pelicans team in order for me to truly invest in terms of fantasy on them as well. But I certainly feel that each and every single one of these Pelicans players can offer something different to you in terms of fantasy. Dejounte Murray, one of the only two players in the league last year with 1,500 points, 500 assists, and 100 steals outside of Nikola Jokic. So that's fantastic company for him. So he can be seen as a huge asset in terms of fantasy for you guys. And also Zion, I think that his production in terms of points and rebounds will elevate. And Ingram and McCollum shouldn't necessarily panic as much. And you shouldn't necessarily panic as a fantasy manager in terms of deciding to pick them. Now, what does this do for the other team in this trade? The Atlanta Hawks. Obviously, you never want to lose a guy like Dejounte Murray, especially when you're building a nice little duopoly with him and Trae Young. But I kind of feel like it was going to happen, especially due to the fact that they got that number one pick in the lottery, selected Zachary Razakar, and kind of look like they're going in a different direction where they're not necessarily building through their guard play, but might be building through their big men. But I certainly feel like it doesn't necessarily impact Trae Young negatively just yet. I think he certainly gets more volume. What I'm kind of worried about, however, is the risk for injury here, because no matter how prolific Trae Young is, I feel that he definitely gets overworked in this offense. Last year we saw Dejounte Murray kind of elevate his game to help Trae Young out, but when Trae Young is alone, he can't do everything by himself. He kind of reminds me of a player like Jalen Brunson, where he has to play every minute in order for his team to compete, and they look drastically different when he is off the court. And so, adding that level of volume might be a bit risky, but he definitely will get much more production out of it, and he certainly could be a top fantasy point guard yet again as a fantasy manager. So, looking for him to be that centerpiece of the Atlanta Hawks rebuild could bode well, but it also could be an ominous sign of the decline of Trae Young should he feel overwhelmed by the level of production he receives. But with that being said, I certainly think Razakar, no matter how much criticism will come over him, definitely not the strongest number one pick in recent memory, but he definitely adds a lot of upside. I think that the Hawks certainly need big men because they just have a lot of different role players and not a true identity. So they need someone to say, hey, he can have an identity outside of Trae Young, and Razakar can certainly be that guy. I think that they should kind of stick him at, say, the power forward center spot, because that might be best for him to develop, and they certainly seem as if they need that kind of infrastructure in the middle. But ultimately, I just think that Razakar just needs that development. I think that he needs to be entrusted with this idea of growth within himself and within the system. I think that transitioning from the French game to the NBA, much like what happened with Wemby, is going to be difficult, but I think he'll find his footing, because Wemby did find his footing, and now he's the cream of the league. Definitely looking to be one of the better fantasy players. And maybe that could be Razakar in 4 or 5 years, because he's not as polished as Wemby. But ultimately, both these teams right now are in drastically opposite directions. I think the New Orleans Pelicans are looking to attack this crowded Western Conference, and the Atlanta Hawks are just looking to stay in that play-in range and hopefully find some wins to vault them into the upper echelon of the Eastern Conference. But for now, I would say I'm much more confident in how the New Orleans Pelicans have built their team than the Atlanta Hawks, because this certainly feels like one of those drafts that can be very hit or miss. And if the Hawks miss on this pick, losing Dejounte Murray will hurt that much more. I think the Hawks certainly could have had more value had they traded down. There's a lot of talks about that, and gotten someone like a Donovan Clingan, who down the road could help you out just because of his physicality he brings. And, maybe he could have been the center you need to kind of balance out Trae Young and Dejounte Murray's play. But it's now in the past. It can't be reversed. And so the Atlanta Hawks are now in a conundrum where they have to rely on Razakar, and if he's a failure, then their organization in many ways has failed as well. Whereas the Pelicans were like, hey, we have just seen so many teams pass us by in the Western Conference. We don't want to get left behind, especially when Zion is still in the prime of his career. And we just need someone that can lighten his load. And so we have to scope out and swing for the fences. And with this Dejounte Murray trade, I truly feel like they have elevated themselves to one of those teams that you might in the future be betting on to win the NBA championship, or at least the Western Conference, because of the sheer abilities of each of these players. They are fantastically different player profiles, but I just feel like they can work together. I think that with Murray's defense, with Zion's rim presence, with Ingram's shot creation, and McCollum's just in industry and work rate, I feel like the Pelicans are rounding into form a little bit here. All of those 4 players can be true fantasy assets to all of you if you're looking to them in terms of the draft. But that should just about do it for this segment of today's show. Coming up next, we also are going to stick with the basketball realm a little bit more and talk about some fantasy takeaways that I saw from last season in the NBA. It should be a fascinating segment. You guys don't want to miss it, as we are in the home stretch of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We'll be right back.